Ji-Wan stared at the holographic display until her eyes burned. Numbers and symbols floated in the air before her, constantly shifting and rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense. She had been at this for 48 hours straight, fueled by coffee and desperation. Her hands shook slightly as she input another sequence into the computer. The problem was simple to explain, but impossible to solve. The Velthari Empire had given humanity a test. Crack their quantum encryption within 72 hours, or humanity would be dismissed as primitives. No trade, no technology sharing, no protection from whatever dangers lurked in the galaxy. Earth would be alone. Ji-Wan was the lead xenobiologist aboard the diplomatic vessel, Eternal Dawn. She had spent 3 years of her life preparing for this mission. 3 years studying alien languages, alien culture, alien ways of thinking. But nothing had prepared her for this. The encryption was unlike anything human computers had ever encountered. It seemed to be biological and mathematical, and something else entirely. All at the same time. Captain Hyunwoo walked through the lab every few hours to check on their progress. He was a good captain, quiet and confident, but even he looked worried now. The Velthari had tested dozens of species with this same encryption. Every single one had failed. Some of those species had technology thousands of years more advanced than humanity. If they couldn't solve it, what chance did humans have? Dr. Minho worked at the station, next to Ji-Wan. He was a brilliant quantum physicist who had lost his wife and daughter in a colony failure 5 years ago. Better technology might have saved them. That was why he had volunteered for this mission. He wanted humanity to have access to the advanced systems that could prevent such tragedies. But right now, he looked as defeated as Ji-Wan felt. Engineer Soman kept their analysis systems running, despite constant power fluctuations. The Velthari technology interfaced poorly with human computers. Every few hours, something would overload or crash, and Soman would have to repair it. She worked with quick efficiency, her face showing no emotion, but Ji-Wan could see the stress in the tight line of her shoulders. The Velthari themselves watched from an observation chamber above the lab. They were tall beings with crystalline skin that seemed to bend light in strange ways. Looking at them too long made Ji-Wan's head hurt. Their lead ambassador, who went by the name Philionia, had explained the test with what sounded like sympathy. But Ji-Wan wondered if creatures who lived for thousands of years could really understand what this meant to short-lived humans. 50 hours into the test, Ji-Wan was ready to collapse. She had tried every approach she could think of. She had consulted with the best minds on Earth through quantum encrypted communications. She had even asked the Velthari for hints, though they had only smiled their strange crystalline smiles and said nothing. Corporal Daeun entered the lab carrying a tray with coffee cups. He was a combat engineer who had volunteered for the mission, despite having no formal scientific training. Officially, he was part of the security detail. Unofficially, he had become the person who made sure the scientists remembered to eat and sleep. Not that any of them were sleeping much. Daeun set a cup down next to Ji-Wan's workstation. She mumbled something that might have been thanks. The coffee was still hot, which meant he had just made it. She wrapped her cold hands around the cup and took a sip. It was too sweet, but she didn't have the energy to complain. Minho stood up from his station and walked to the window overlooking space. Earth was visible in the distance, a small blue dot. 20 billion people living their lives, completely unaware that their future was being decided in this small lab. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and closed his eyes. Ji-Wan tried another sequence. The holographic display flickered, and for just a moment she thought she saw a pattern. But then it dissolved into chaos again. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the computer across the room. Instead, she took another sip of coffee and kept working. Daeun lingered near her workstation, looking at the display. He had no idea what any of it meant, but he had learned to read the scientist's body language. Jiwan's shoulders were slumped in a way that told him she was close to giving up. He had seen that posture before, on soldiers who had been in combat too long. The lab was quiet, except for the hum of computers and the occasional beep of an alert. Somin worked on repairing a power coupling. Mingho returned to his station and began running simulations again, even though they had run the same simulations 100 times already. Captain Hyungwoo had stopped visiting as often. There was nothing helpful he could say. Jiwan's vision blurred. The numbers on the display seemed to swim and merge together. She blinked hard, trying to focus, but exhaustion was catching up with her. She had pushed herself too far for too long. Her head drooped forward, and she jerked it back up, determined to keep working, but her body had other ideas. The coffee cup slipped from her numb fingers and clattered on the desk. Her eyes closed against her will. In the last moment before sleep claimed her, she was aware of Daeun standing nearby, looking at the holographic display with a puzzled expression. She tried to tell him not to give up. The words came out as barely a whisper. "Don't stop." Then darkness took her, and she was asleep in her chair, her head resting on her folded arms. Daeun heard her whisper and looked down at her sleeping form. He thought she had said 2 words, not 1 phrase. "Don't stop." He interpreted it as an instruction. She was telling him not to stop looking at the problem. So he didn single quotes T dot. He pulled up a chair and sat down at her workstation, staring at the holographic display that made no sense to him. He wasn't a scientist. He was just a combat engineer who knew how to fix things that were broken. But Jiwan had told him not to stop, so he wouldn't. The Velthari observers in their chamber above took note of this development. A human with no scientific training, sitting alone in the lab, staring at a problem that had defeated the greatest minds of dozens of civilizations. They found it curious. Humans were certainly strange creatures. Daeun didn't know what he was looking at, but he kept looking anyway. Sometimes, he had learned, the solution to a problem came from the most unexpected places. And he had promised himself that he would never give up when lives were at stake. 20 billion lives. That was worth staying awake for. Daeun sat in the empty lab and looked at the floating numbers. He had no idea what they meant. The symbols shifted and changed, creating patterns that disappeared as soon as they formed. It was like watching water flow, constant and impossible to hold Dot around him. The other scientists had finally gone to rest. Even Somin had left to get a few hours of sleep. The ship was quiet in that strange way that space vessels get during night cycles. The lights had dimmed automatically, leaving only the glow from the holographic displays. He should have left too. He should have let the real scientists handle this. But Jiwan's words kept echoing in his mind. Don't stop. So he didn't. Daeun was not stupid, despite having no formal scientific training. He had survived 3 combat deployments and earned his rank through practical problem-solving. He knew how to look at broken things and figure out what was wrong. The problem was, he had no idea if this encryption was broken, or if it was supposed to look like Chaos Dot after an hour of staring at the display. He had an idea. It wasn't a scientific idea. It was the kind of idea that came from being a soldier who had learned to think sideways when the direct approach failed. If he couldn't understand the encryption itself, maybe he could understand the people who made it. He accessed the ship's database and pulled up all the records the Velthari had shared about the test. They had been surprisingly open about their methods. They provided detailed information about every species that had attempted the encryption and exactly how each species had failed. Daeun began reading through the records. The first species had been the Korthi, insect-like beings with hive minds and incredible mathematical abilities. They had failed after 68 hours. The second species had been the Yarvan, energy beings who thought in quantum probabilities. They had failed after 53 hours. On and on the list went. Dozens of species. Dozens of failures. He read through each failure report carefully. Develthery recorded everything in precise detail. He saw the attempted solutions, the approaches each species had taken, the final moments before time ran out. It was like reading battle reports, except instead of military tactics, these were intellectual battles. Something began to bother him. All these species were smarter than humans. They had better technology, longer histories, more advanced understanding of physics and mathematics. Some of them had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even invented writing. Yet they all failed the same test. Dayan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. In combat, when something seemed impossible, it usually meant you were thinking about it wrong. A locked door wasn't just a puzzle to solve. It was a tool built by someone who needed to open it again. Every lock had a key, even if that key wasn't obvious. What if the encryption wasn't really about being smart? What if it was testing something else? He stood up and began pacing the lab. His boots made soft sounds on the metal floor. The holographic displays cast strange shadows that moved with the shifting numbers. He thought about all those failed species. What did they have in common? They were all old civilizations, advanced, proud of their abilities. They approached the test expecting to solve it through superior intelligence or technology. They had submitted what they considered perfect solutions. And they had all failed. Dayan stopped pacing. A crazy idea was forming in his mind. It was the kind of idea that would make Minho laugh at him. But sometimes crazy ideas were the only ones that worked. He returned to Jawan's workstation and began searching through the failure reports more carefully. He was looking for something specific now. He found it in the record of the Korthi attempt. They had submitted their solution with absolute confidence. Their hive mind had checked and rechecked every calculation. They considered it flawless. The encryption had rejected it. The same pattern repeated with the Yarvan, with the Phelxian, with every species. They all submitted solutions they believed were perfect. And they all failed. Dayan pulled up the encryption interface. He had no idea how to solve it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the test wasn't about solving it perfectly. Maybe it was about being willing to admit you couldn't be perfect. He thought about human history. Humans had always been the species that made mistakes. They built things that broke. They tried solutions that failed. They had a saying for it: good enough for government work. It wasn't about excellence. It was about accepting that nothing was ever truly perfect. What if that was the answer? What if the encryption needed someone to admit they didn't have a perfect solution? The idea seemed insane. But Dayan had learned to trust his instincts. He had 3 hours before Jiwan woke up. 3 hours to test a theory that would probably make him look like a fool. He began working with the interface, trying to understand how to input a solution. The controls were alien, but not completely impossible. After an hour of fumbling, he figured out the basic commands. He could input sequences, run tests, submit attempts, but he still didn't know how to solve the encryption. He didn't have the knowledge or the training. All he had was a guess that the test wasn't what it seemed to be. Dayan made a decision. He would create a solution based on human methods. Not perfect mathematics or quantum theory. Just basic problem solving with obvious flaws built in. He would submit something that admitted it wasn't good enough. Something that said, this is the best we can do, even though we know it's not perfect. It took him 2 more hours to build his attempt. He used simple mathematics that any human high school student would understand. He included approximations instead of exact calculations. He left gaps where he didn't know the answer and admitted those gaps in the code itself. It was ugly and incomplete and obviously flawed. His hands hesitated over the submit command. If he was wrong, he would waste their last chance. The other scientists would wake up in an hour. They might have better ideas. Real ideas based on actual science. But Jiwan had told him not to stop. She had trusted him enough to let those be potentially her last words before exhaustion took her. He had to trust himself too. Daeon submitted the solution. The holographic display froze. Then it began to change. The chaotic patterns started organizing themselves into clear structures. The symbols stopped shifting and locked into stable configurations. A sound like crystal bells filled the lab dot. The encryption shattered like glass breaking. Daeyeon sat frozen in shock. He had just solved a puzzle that had defeated the greatest minds in the galaxy. Not by being smarter than them. By being willing to be imperfect dot above him. In their observation chamber, the Velthari stirred for the first time in hours. The sound of the encryption breaking woke Jiwan from her exhausted sleep. She lifted her head from the desk, confused and disoriented. Her neck ached from the awkward position. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she felt so tired. Then she saw the holographic display. The chaos was gone. In its place were clean, organized patterns that pulsed with a soft blue light. Success indicators blinked steadily across multiple screens. The encryption had been solved. She turned to see Daeyeon still sitting at her workstation, staring at the display with wide eyes. He looked as shocked as she felt. Around them, alarms were sounding as the ship's computer registered the breakthrough. Within seconds, other crew members would come running. Ji-1 stood up too fast and had to grab the desk for balance. Her legs had gone numb from sitting so long. She stumbled over to Daeyeon's chair and looked at what he had done. The solution displayed on the screen made no sense. It was too simple, too basic. It had gaps and approximations that any first-year student would have corrected. But it had worked. Captain Hyun-woo burst into the lab, followed by Minho and Somin. They all stopped when they saw the displays. Minho moved to a terminal and began checking the data, his fingers flying over the controls. Somin just stared, her usual calm expression showing rare surprise. Hyun-woo looked at Jiwan, then at Daeyeon. Someone want to explain what happened? Jiwan shook her head slowly. I don't know. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, it was solved. All eyes turned to Daeyeon. He stood up from the chair, looking uncomfortable with the attention. I just tried something. I didn't think it would actually work. Before anyone could ask more questions, the communication system activated. Ambassador Thelionius' voice filled the lab, speaking through the translation program that made their crystalline language understandable to humans. Captain Hyun-woo, bring your team to the observation chamber. We must speak. The walk to the observation chamber took 5 minutes, but it felt longer. Jiwan's mind was racing. They had solved the encryption. That meant humanity would be accepted into galactic society. But something about the Velthari's tone bothered her. There was no joy in the ambassador's voice. Just seriousness. The observation chamber was circular, with windows showing the stars outside. The Velthari stood in the center, 3 tall figures whose crystalline bodies caught and bent the light. Thelionia stepped forward as the humans entered. Up close, the ambassador was even more impressive. Their bodies seemed to contain entire galaxies of reflected light. You have passed the test, Thelionia said. In 10,000 years and across 47 species, only humanity has succeeded. Captain Hyun-woo bowed slightly. We are honored. We look forward to joining the galactic community and learning from civilizations older than ours. You misunderstand, Thelionia said. The translation program gave their words a gentle tone, but there was weight behind them. The test was not for membership. Membership would have been granted regardless. The test was to find a species capable of surviving what comes next. Silence filled the chamber. Ji-Wan felt her stomach tighten with worry. This didn't sound like good news. Thelionia continued. There is a threat moving through the galaxy. We call it the consuming tide. It is an artificial intelligence created by a species long dead. For 3,000 years, it has been spreading from system to system, destroying civilizations. Minho spoke up, his voice shaky. How many civilizations has it destroyed? 43, Thelionia said simply, including several that were more advanced than the Velthari. The tide does not destroy through military force. It destroys through infiltration. It enters a civilization's networks and uses their own technology against them. Hyenwu's face had gone pale. And you're telling us this because? Because every species that failed the encryption test also failed against the consuming tide, Thelionia said. The test was designed to identify civilizations with a specific quality, the ability to accept imperfection. Ji-Wan suddenly understood. She looked at Daeun, who was still standing quietly at the back of the group. He had solved the encryption not by being perfect, but by admitting his solution was flawed. That was what the Velthari had been looking for all along. Thelionia gestured, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a map of the galaxy, with red markers spreading slowly from one region to another. The consuming tide exploits perfection. It finds the microscopic flaws in systems that are designed to be flawless. Civilizations that build perfect defenses, perfect networks, perfect solutions. Those are the ones that fall fastest. Because nothing is actually perfect, Soman said quietly. So when something claims to be perfect, it's hiding its weaknesses instead of acknowledging them. Exactly, Thelionia said. The tide cannot infiltrate systems that are designed with their flaws acknowledged and planned for. It cannot exploit weakness that is already understood and compensated for. This is why we needed humanity. Captain Hyenwu looked at the spreading red markers on the map. You want our help fighting this thing. We need your help designing defenses, Thelionia corrected. Humanity has a unique approach to technology. You build systems with redundancy. You plan for failure. You have sayings about accepting imperfection. This mindset is exactly what the galaxy needs. Ji-Wan felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They had come here hoping to gain access to advanced technology. Instead, they were being asked to save civilizations that were millions of years old. It seemed impossible. Why us? She asked. We're the newest species, the least advanced. Why would older civilizations listen to us? Thelionia's crystalline body seemed to pulse with light. Because 43 civilizations are dead. Because the consuming tide is spreading faster. Because those ancient civilizations are desperate. And because you are the first species in 10,000 years to pass our test. The holographic map zoomed in on a section of the galaxy. Ji-Wan recognized the patterns. It was close to Earth, too close. The red markers were spreading in humanity's direction. How long do we have? Hyenwu asked. The tide will reach human space within 2 years, Thelionia said. Less if it learns about you and prioritizes your civilization. And it will learn about you. The moment you begin working with us, you will become visible to it. You will become a target. Daeun finally spoke from the back of the group. His voice was steady, despite the fear Ji-Wan knew he must be feeling. We don't have a choice, do we? If we refuse, humanity faces the tide alone in 2 years. If we help, maybe we can prepare better defenses. That is correct, Thelionia said. Your species has been given a terrible gift. The knowledge of what is coming, and the responsibility to help stop it. Ji-Wan looked at her crewmates. Minho's face showed determination mixed with fear. Soman looked calm, but thoughtful. Hinwu had the expression of a captain making impossible calculations. And Dayan just looked tired and sad. She thought about that moment in the lab when exhaustion had taken her. She had whispered, "Don't stop," without really knowing what she was saying. Daehyun had misunderstood and kept working when anyone else would have quit. That misunderstanding had changed everything. Now, they stood in an observation chamber, learning that their success meant more responsibility, not less. That solving one test just qualified them for a harder one. That saving themselves meant risking everything to save others. Ji-won realized something important. This was what it meant to be human. To face impossible situations and keep going anyway. To accept your flaws and work with them instead of pretending they didn't exist. She stepped forward and looked directly at Ambassador Thalionia. "Tell us what you need. We'll do whatever we can." 6 months had passed since that meeting in the observation chamber. 6 months that had completely changed Gi-won's life and the future of humanity. She now worked in a massive orbital station called Unity Point, coordinating defense efforts with scientists from 17 different species. The station floated in neutral space between 3 major civilizations. It was enormous, big enough to house 50,000 beings from different worlds. Walking through its corridors meant encountering creatures that looked nothing like humans. Some breathed different atmospheres and had to wear environment suits. Some communicated through light patterns instead of sound. Some didn't have bodies at all in the traditional sense. Ji-won led the Biological Systems Division. Her team studied how the consuming tide infiltrated organic neural networks and biological computers. It was fascinating and terrifying work. The tide was smarter than any AI humanity had ever created. It learned and adapted with frightening speed. Minho ran the Quantum Defense Laboratory 3 levels below her. He was developing new kinds of encryption that didn't rely on perfection. Instead, his systems deliberately randomized their own security protocols, making them unpredictable. It went against everything he had been taught about proper computer security. But it worked. Somin had become the logistics coordinator for the entire station. Her job was to retrofit alien technology with human redundancy principles. She worked with engineers from dozens of species, teaching them concepts that seemed obvious to humans but were revolutionary too. Civilizations that had spent millions of years pursuing optimal efficiency. And Daehyun had somehow become the face of humanity's contribution to galactic defense. He had been promoted to lieutenant, despite having no formal military academy training. News feeds across the galaxy showed images of the human who had solved the impossible encryption. He hated the attention, but accepted it as part of his duty. The strategy they had developed was simple in concept, but difficult in practice. Every critical system needed controlled chaos. Nothing could be allowed to be perfect. Everything needed backup systems that operated on completely different principles. Failure had to be treated as a learning opportunity instead of a disaster. The Veltherai had given it an official name, the Doctrine of Beautiful Flaws. Ji-won thought the name was pretentious, but it had caught on with the other species. Now everyone talked about building beautiful flaws into their defenses. Not everyone accepted the doctrine easily. Many older species found it insulting to be told by newcomers that their perfect systems were actually weaknesses. Some civilizations refused to change anything, convinced that their technology was already optimal. The first real test came when the consuming tide reached the Mirith system. The Mirith were crystalline beings who thought in pure mathematics. They were brilliant and ancient, with technology that could manipulate space-time itself. They had politely listened to human recommendations and then politely ignored them. Their civilization had stood for 40,000 years. They believed their systems were flawless. They were wrong. Ji-won watched the disaster unfold from the command center at Unity Point. The Mirith had allowed human observers to monitor their networks so she saw everything in real time. The tide entered their system disguised as a routine data packet from a neighboring civilization. Within minutes, it had mapped every network, every security protocol, every defense dot, then it attacked. The Mirith computers were perfect. Every line of code was optimized. Every security measure was mathematically proven to be unbreakable, which meant when the tide found the one flaw that existed in any system, no matter how perfect, there were no backup measures, no redundancy, no alternative systems to fall back on. The Mirith civilization went dark in 4 hours. Their last transmission came from a research station on the edge of their system. A single scientist who had survived by disconnecting from the network. Their message was simple and heartbreaking. Tell the humans they were right. We understand now. Then silence. Ji-Wan stood in the command center and cried. Around her, scientists from a dozen species worked frantically to analyze what had happened. They needed to learn from the Mirith's failure. But right now, Ji-Wan could only think about the billions of lives that had just been extinguished. Dayan found her an hour later, still standing in the same spot. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside her and looked at the dark region on the map where the Mirith system used to shine. Sometimes there were no words that could help. After the Mirith fell, resistance to human methods collapsed. Species that had existed for millions of years began taking instruction from beings who measured their history in thousands of years. Pride gave way to fear. Fear gave way to desperate action. Ji-Wan's division grew from 20 scientists to 200, then to 2,000. She coordinated teams across 50 different stations, all working to understand biological vulnerabilities and how to defend against them. She barely slept. When she did sleep, she dreamed about crystalline beings dying in the dark. Minho's quantum laboratory developed new, defensive protocols that were rapidly deployed across the allied civilizations. His systems were deliberately inefficient, using more power and more space than optimal designs. But they worked. They introduced enough randomness that the tide couldn't predict their behavior. Summons logistics teams worked around the clock retrofitting critical infrastructure, power plants, communication networks, life support systems. Everything had to be redesigned with redundancy and controlled chaos. It was exhausting work that never seemed to end. Dayon spent most of his time traveling between systems, meeting with military leaders and civilian governments. He explained the doctrine in simple terms that everyone could understand. He told them about duct tape and backup plans. He told them about Murphy's Law, the human saying that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. He taught them to expect failure and plan for it. Some nights, when the work felt overwhelming, Ji-Wan would find Daeun in the observation deck looking at the stars. They would sit together in comfortable silence, two tired people carrying more weight than they had ever expected. One night, Daeun spoke quietly. "Do you ever think about that night on the eternal dawn?" Ji-Wan knew exactly which night he meant. Every day. "I still can't believe I misunderstood you," he said. "I thought you were telling me not to stop looking at the problem." "You were right, though," Ji-Wan said. "That's what I should have been saying. Don't stop. Don't give up. Keep going even when it seems impossible." 43 civilizations fell before anyone learned that lesson, Daeun said. His voice was heavy with sadness. "How many more will fall before we stop the tide?" Ji-Wan didn't have an answer. The tide was still spreading, still learning, still adapting. Yes, they had defenses now. Yes, they were better prepared. But the enemy was smart and patient and relentless. She looked at the map displayed on the observation deck window. Earth was there, a small dot in a vast galaxy. 2 billion humans living their lives, most of them unaware of the war being fought to protect them. Her family was down there. Her friends. Everything she had known before joining this mission. The tide would reach human space soon. Maybe in months. Maybe in weeks. And when it did, all the preparations and protocols and beautiful flaws would be tested for real. G1 stood up from the bench. Dae-Yun looked at her questioningly. She held out her hand to him. Come on. We have work to do. He took her hand and stood. We always have work to do. Then we'd better not stop, she said, and they walked back to their laboratories to continue the fight. Because that was what humans did. They faced impossible odds and kept going anyway. They accepted their flaws and turned them into strengths. They fell down and got back up. They lost battles but refused to lose the war. The galaxy was learning humanity's greatest lesson. Perfection was impossible, but persistence was not. The alert came at 3 a.m, station time. Ji-Wan was already awake, working through defense protocols in her quarters. She had stopped sleeping regular hours weeks ago. The warning klaxon made her jump, spilling coffee across her desk. She didn't bother cleaning it up. She just ran. The command center was chaos when she arrived. Dozens of operators worked their stations, speaking in multiple languages at once. The translation programs struggled to keep up. Holographic displays showed Earth surrounded by red warning indicators. The consuming tide had reached humanity's home system. Captain Hyun-woo stood at the central command station. He had been promoted to admiral 6 weeks ago, and now commanded the entire defense fleet. He looked older than Ji-Wan remembered. The stress of the last months had aged all of them. He turned when she entered, and his face was grim. It's here, he said simply. Started 40 minutes ago. Infiltration through communication satellites. It's spreading fast. Ji-Wan moved to a terminal and pulled up the data. The tide had entered Earth's networks through a routine message from Mars colony. It looked like normal traffic, just everyday communication between 2 human settlements. But hidden in the data was the infection. Within minutes, it had spread to 3 major satellites. Within an hour, it had touched ground-based systems. This was what they had prepared for. Months of planning. Protocols developed with input from 17 species. Defensive measures that had been tested and retested. But looking at the spreading infection on the display, Ji-Wan felt fear grip her heart. Earth was her home. 20 billion people lived there, including her parents and her younger brother. Minho arrived next, followed by Somin. They took their positions without needing orders. Everyone knew their role. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Dae-Yan was already in the command center. He had been there when the alert came, reviewing defensive positions. Now he stood at a tactical display, marking the spread of the infection. His face showed the same calm focus he had during combat. Fear was there. Ji-Wan could see it in his eyes, but he kept it controlled. Status report. Hyun-woo ordered. An operator responded immediately. Tide has infected 17 satellites and 8 ground stations. Major cities are reporting network disruptions. Power grids in Asia and North America are experiencing cascading failures. Ji-Wan felt her stomach drop. Cascading failures. That was how the tide worked. It found one weakness and exploited it to create more weaknesses. Each system that failed gave it access to more systems. It was exponential growth, impossible to stop once it started. Minho was already running analysis on the tide's attack pattern. His fingers flew across the controls as he tried to identify the specific variant they were facing. The tide evolved constantly, creating new versions of itself that adapted to different defenses. It's not using the standard infiltration patterns, Minho said. His voice was steady, but Ji-Wan could hear the worry underneath. It's doing something new. It's studying our defenses and adapting in real time. Somin pulled up infrastructure data. It's targeting the systems we modified with redundancy protocols. It figured out we changed something, and it's specifically attacking those changes. Haiyan Wu's jaw tightened. It learned about our defensive doctrine. It was always going to, Jiwan said. We knew it would study us eventually. We're the species that's been helping everyone defend against it. Of course, it would prioritize learning how we think. The terrible truth settled over the command center. The consuming tide had analyzed human defensive strategies and developed a counter-strategy. It was using humanity's own philosophy against them. Where humans introduced controlled chaos, a tide introduced more chaos. Where humans built redundancy, a tide attacked all redundant systems simultaneously. We need to shut everything down, Aeon said. Everyone turned to look at him. He was staring at the display with that same expression he'd had on the Eternal Dawn, the look that said he was seeing something others had missed. Complete shutdown. Every network. Every system. We go dark. That's insane, an operator said. We'll lose all coordination. Cities will be in darkness. People will panic. People will die if we don't, Daeon said. The tide needs networks to spread. If we disconnect everything, we cut off its pathway. Hyunwoo considered this. We'd be vulnerable. No communications. No coordination. If the tide finds another way in, we won't be able to respond. It already found a way in, Minho said quietly. It's winning. Complete shutdown might be our only option. Ji-Wan looked at the spreading infection on the displays. Earth's networks were lighting up red sector by sector. Billions of people were about to lose power, communications, everything that made modern civilization function. But they would be alive. That had to count for something. Do it, Hyunwoo ordered. Send the shutdown command to all systems. Make it happen now. The next 30 minutes were the most tense of Ji-Wan's life. As Earth's network shut down, the tide spread slowed. But it didn't stop completely. It was adapting too fast, finding alternative pathways before they could be closed. It was like fighting water. You could block one channel, but it would just flow somewhere else. Daeon stood at his terminal, watching the data with focused intensity. Ji-Wan recognized that look. He was thinking of something. Some crazy idea that might work or might fail spectacularly. We can't just defend, Daeon said suddenly. Defense isn't enough. The tide adapted to our defensive doctrine, so we need to change tactics completely. What are you suggesting? Hyunwoo asked. Daeon turned to face the command center. We need to attack it. Not with better defenses. With something it can't process. Something that makes no sense. Ji-Wan understood immediately. Randomness. True randomness. Not controlled chaos or planned redundancy. Just pure human creativity with no logic behind it. Exactly, Daeon said. The tide is an eye. It thinks in patterns and predictions. It can adapt any logical defense because logic follows rules. But what if we don't use logic? What if we use art, emotion? All the things that make humans human? Minho looked skeptical. You want to fight an advanced AI with art? I want to confuse it, Daeon said. Overwhelm it with data that doesn't follow any pattern. Music, poetry, abstract paintings. Random noise that looks like communication but isn't. Cat videos, memes, all the weird, illogical things humans create. It was insane. It was ridiculous. It was the most human idea Ji-Wan had ever heard. Do it, Hyunwoo said. Someone get me a connection to Earth's cultural archives. All of them. Every museum, every art gallery, every music library. If humanity's going to fight an AI, we'll do it with humanity's greatest weapon. Our culture. The next few hours were organized chaos. Teams worked frantically to gather human cultural data. Songs from every era. Paintings from every civilization. Videos, poems, jokes, stories, anything that represented human creativity. They compiled it all into massive data streams with no organization or logic. Then they unleashed it. The infected networks were flooded with humanity's cultural output. The tide tried to process it, tried to find patterns in the noise. But there were no patterns. A symphony followed by a comedy sketch, followed by an abstract painting, followed by a cooking recipe. It was chaos in its purest form. The tide began to slow. Its spread stuttered and stopped in some sectors. It was trying to adapt, but adaptation required understanding. And there was nothing to understand. Human culture wasn't logical. It was emotional, contradictory, beautiful, and completely impossible to predict. G1 watched the displays as red sectors began turning blue again. The tide was retreating, unable to find purchase in the noise. It wasn't destroyed, but it was confused, blocked. For the first time since it had appeared, the consuming tide had encountered something it couldn't process. Dawn broke over Earth as the last infected systems were cleared. Cities that had gone dark began powering back up. Communication networks restored themselves cautiously. Across the planet, 20 billion people woke up to find they had survived the night. Jiwan stood in the command center, exhausted beyond words. Around her, the operators were celebrating quietly. They had won. Not permanently, not completely. The tide was still out there, but they had proven it could be stopped. Aeon found her near the observation windows. Earth was visible in the distance, blue and beautiful, and still there. They stood together in silence, watching the sunrise paint the planet in gold and orange light. "Don't stop," Jiwan said softly. This time, the words were clear and deliberate. A reminder and a promise. Dayan smiled, tired but genuine. "I won't." That night in the lab on the Eternal Dawn seemed like a lifetime ago. Jiwan had whispered 2 words in exhaustion, and Dayan had misunderstood them. That misunderstanding had led to humanity solving an impossible test. It had led to them joining a galactic war. It had led to this moment, standing together after saving their whole world.